Hey, good evening. There's seats up front as you're coming in. Welcome to the 60th annual meeting of the Psychonomic Society. My name is Laura Carlson, and it has been my pleasure to serve as chair of the governing board this year. Every year at Psychonomics, I hear complaints about how long this evening typically takes, and that everyone really just comes to hear the keynote. So that's what we're going to do. The slides you've been looking at have provided all the up-to-date information you need to know about the conference. The awards presentation, we've now moved to the newly named Awards and Business meeting on Saturday. Come early for a champagne toast, stay late for cake, celebrating our 60th birthday. And a new first for us, we are live streaming the keynote, so I welcome those who are viewing from afar. And so, without further ado, I invite Fernanda Ferreira, our exceptional governing board member, former publication chair, and fellow psycholinguist, to introduce Judy Kroll, our keynote speaker this evening.
Well, it is a tremendous honor to introduce Professor Judith Kroll as the Psychonomic Society's 2019 keynote speaker. I've known Judy since we were both members of the Five College community in Massachusetts when she was a faculty member at Mount Holyoke College and I was a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Judy is currently a distinguished professor of language science at the University of California, Irvine. Prior to that, Judy was a member of the faculty at UC Riverside, at Penn State University, Mount Holyoke College, as I mentioned earlier, Rutgers, and at Swarthmore. She's also held numerous prestigious visiting positions, including at Stanford, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the University of Nijmegen. Judy is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, too many for me to list here. But to give a few highlights, she is a fellow of the Psychonomic Society, the Association for Psychological Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Psychological Association Division III. She also served on the Psychonomic Society Governing Board from 2006 to 2011. She's published well over 100 articles, well over, and her research has been continuously funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, among other funding organizations. Judy has made far too many contributions to our field to allow me to mention all of them, so I'll just bring up two in this introduction. First, Judy has been committed to understanding how the language processing system works, with a focus on how that system operates when a person knows more than one language. And second, she has worked tirelessly to promote social justice in science, with a particular focus on the role of women in the cognitive sciences. Judy's talk is the best way to learn about her influential theoretical work and findings. So for now, I will just say that she essentially established the research area of bilingualism, which is now one of the most vibrant and productive areas of the cognitive sciences and the neurosciences. And how appropriate that she is our keynote speaker for this meeting that is being held in the city of Montreal. As most of you know, Canada is a bilingual country. Both French and English are official languages across the country. In Montreal, most people speak French. And across the country, the presence of and respect for linguistic and cultural diversity has always been a core part of the Canadian identity, I say as a proud Canadian. But I want to highlight how groundbreaking Judy's work on equity for women in our disciplines has been as well. And I'll confess, when I started out in psycholinguistics, I thought everything with respect to gender issues was just fine, because the field appeared to be about 50% female, and I had been fortunate enough to work with some strong, brilliant women, both as a graduate student and as an undergraduate. And I'll even admit I was a bit skeptical when discussions around gender equity started to happen. But because of the difficult and sometimes controversial and always rigorous work that Judy and other pioneers have done, I and many, many others now recognize how wrong we were. Now it seems like almost every day we're confronted with new evidence of gender bias in science, whether it takes the form of an anecdote or a systematic empirical investigation. I also believe that opening up that conversation disinhibited our entire field when it comes to conversations about equity and representation in general. So now we have organizations such as the Spark Society, which is committed to promoting people of color in our field, and Women in Cognitive Science, or WICS, which is committed to promoting women, among many other kinds of similar initiatives. Spark and Wix both held events today, which I hope you were able to attend. If not, please think about making them part of your plans for future Psychonomics. I see these innovations as part of a new, exciting, and welcome trend to make science stronger by making it fairer, more humane, and more inclusive. As scientists, we are always going to be tough, and we're always going to exercise our critical faculties to the max, but we're now much more conscious of the fact that we don't have to be unkind about it, and that science is better when it's open and inclusive. In summary, Judy defined a research area, and through her service to the field, she's made our world a better place. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judith Kroll as our 2019 Psychonomics Society keynote speaker.
Thank you, Fernanda, and thank you to the Psychonomics Society and to all of you for giving me this fantastic honor to be here and to be in Montreal at this moment is very special. I wanted to start by saying that I'm going to ask that I not have questions after the talk so that we can, I know everyone, it's late and everyone is going to want to go off to the reception. But I also want to say that I'm very open to talking, and this is the beginning of the meeting. I'll be very happy to talk in person, and for those of you who are beaming in from wherever you are, I'm also very happy to do email, Skype, however you'd like to ask questions. So tonight I want to talk about bilingualism and about how bilingualism reveals the networks that shape the mind and the brain. I need to start by saying that I am indebted to many, many people, too many people who I cannot acknowledge fully this evening. But for a very long time, I worked in the middle of Pennsylvania, which, as you might imagine, is not the mecca of bilingualism. And there is a silver lining, and the silver lining is that you end up having collaborators and colleagues in many places in the world that enable you to do this kind of research. And one of the consequences of that is that together with Penn State, we have an international research network for research on bilingualism that has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and that provides a fantastic resource for students to be able to travel abroad to do research. So life experience changes us in many, many different ways, whether we're musicians, whether we're learning a new skill, whether we're exercising, whether we're playing video games. And the question that we want to think about throughout my talk is whether learning and using a second language is really different than exercise, learning to play the cello, becoming a skilled programmer or video gamer. This is hard to do. So some argue that language is special, that it's not the same as other life experiences in other domains. And for one thing, we do know that learning a second language as an adult, especially in the United States, can be a difficult task.
Ricky, what are you going to say when you meet your grandmother?
What is this, Abuela?
Very good, very good.
What are you going to say, Mommy?
What, dear?
What are you going to say when you meet my mother?
Oh, bonus dies, Maidry.
Buenos dias, Maidry. Honey, it's buenos dias, madre.
I don't think that's very nice, making fun of my Spanish.
Well, you've been making fun of my English for 15 years.
Well, that's different. Spanish is a foreign language.
Well, English is a foreign language to me.
Well, the way you speak it is to me, too.
So maybe Lucy is right. Maybe it's hopeless for adult language learners. And the traditional story in psycholinguistics about second language learning as an adult was that it was a very difficult task. And the data shown on the slide are classic data. The data on the left are accentedness data from Jim Flagy's lab. The data on the right are from a classic study by Johnson and Newport. And what you see on the left is how individuals' accentedness is rated as a function of the age at which they were exposed to the second language. And what you see is the older you were when you were first exposed, the more accented your speech is. And what you see on the right is that the grammar of individuals who speak a second language, who acquired the second language after early childhood, is also somewhat subject to inconsistencies in the ability to correctly judge the grammaticality of sentences. Now, the story about this is beginning to come apart a bit, and that's not going to be the main focus of my talk, although I'm happy to address it later on. But what we've learned is that there's a great deal of plasticity in adulthood that we did not recognize earlier. And more than a decade ago, on the 125th anniversary of the journal Science, there was an editorial that identified the biological basis of second language learning as one of the top 125 questions to be answered in the next 25 years of science. And I underline, in all of science. Right? So this is a major recognition for language science. And what we see on the right is we see a graph taken from Web of Science on a number of articles published on bilingualism between 1993 and 2012. And what you see is there's been a marked upsurge of research on this topic. There's been an explosion of research on bilingualism. And part of what we hear and see in the media is quite positive. So you see headlines in newspapers and other media sources that say, being bilingual is good for your brain. Bilingualism is like a mental gymnasium for your brain. Juggling languages can build better brains. But the truth is that in the US, we are mostly still with Lucy. And what this is a map from Gigi Luck's lab, and this is a map of the United States, and you see the great blue, right? And you might say, fabulous, where did you get that map? And blue is not Democrat. Blue is, very sadly, blue is English only. And blue are places in the United States where there's a very small proportion of the population who speaks a language other than English. What you see is that there's this very red rim around the US in the West, where we live in California, and in the Southwest and in Florida. But most of the country is English only and has the attitude that bilingualism is not very important. Makes sense. And at the same time, we hear in the science and the media reports of the science that there's debate and controversy about whether speaking a second language has benefits for cognition. And so some of us, some of you, may think that the case for bilingualism being a benefit to cognition may have been overstated. And the goal of my talk today is to really ask what we've learned in this period of time, in this rapid upsurge of research. And I want to try to consider a couple of points that I think are really touching the high points of this. I'm going to necessarily, in the time I have available and the scope of this talk, not be able to cover things exhaustively. But what I want to try to convince you of tonight is that there is, in fact, far greater plasticity than we previously understood. Language learning occurs at all ages, and language processes are themselves dynamic. They change with experience, and they change in different contexts. It's also the case that this is not a simple all or none. That language learning and language use are complex life experiences, and they have consequences. They have many different consequences. And the plea that I want to make to the field, and the argument that I want to try to make tonight, is that we need to seek causal mechanisms. We need to ask what aspects of language and language use may produce the consequences of bilingualism that have been observed. So I want to very briefly just highlight a couple of illustrative examples, and they're meant only to be quick illustrative examples, a sort of Sesame Street of what's been found. So starting early in life, in infancy, there are many, many studies, and there are many researchers who are here who focus on what happens in the first year of life when babies are exposed to more than one language. This is a study out of Pat Kuhl's lab at University of Washington. This is a baby in a MEG machine. Nothing invasive is happening to this baby. We're simply looking at brain activity as a function of listening to speech. And what this research shows is that young babies in the first year of life who are exposed to more than one language develop a much broader sensitivity to speech, are able to recognize the speech sounds of a wider number of languages. They're not tuned, they don't become expert in one language alone. And this study in particular, this MEG study, showed that there appears, by 11 months, there appears to be a tuning of the areas of the brain associated with executive function, even in these tiny little babies. Now, what happens if we move up the lifespan? What we see is that these effects extend into young adulthood. This is an illustration of a study from Jubin Aboutaleb's lab in Milan. It's an fMRI study. It's a study that used a task that many of you are very familiar with, the flanker task, which is shown on the right. And so you're just judging whether an arrow is pointed to the right or to the left. And what happened in this study is that bilinguals and monolinguals were compared. They were scanned as they performed the flanker task. And the main point for us tonight is that what you see this bright image in the monolingual brains. You see this bright activity in the monolingual brains. And for the bilinguals, you might even have to squint a little bit to see it. And what the study showed is that the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, which has been implicated as a site in the brain that's responsible for many things, including conflict monitoring, is very active during the solution of the performance of the flanker task. But what we see is that monolingual brains require more activity to solve the same problem relative to bilingual brains. The argument is that bilinguals are more efficient in being able, they're using the same part of the brain, but they're being more efficient in how they solve the problem. And then if we go along the life continuum, along the lifespan to older adults, what we see is that there are dramatic protective consequences of bilingualism. We see that, and I have to say, because this picture, I always show this picture, and I just have to say that I'm not promoting smoking. After everything Fernanda said about social justice, smoking is not up there. And I have no idea if she's actually bilingual. But what we know from the work of Ellen Bialystok initially, and from many, many other people now around the world, is that bilingualism delays the onset of dementia symptoms. Not dementia itself, not Alzheimer's itself, but the symptoms of it. And it delays it by 4 to 5 years, and at present there's no known drug that has that effect. So it's quite a dramatic result. At the same time, at the point where bilinguals are diagnosed with dementia, their brains are more diseased. So again, you have a sort of efficiency argument. What you see is that bilinguals are doing more with less over a longer period of time. So why is there controversy about all of this? Why are people arguing, yes, it's there, no, it's not, and dueling with one another? Well, I want to argue that the past studies are largely correlational. And there's been very little research that's actually addressed what are the causal mechanisms that might produce any of these effects, and that the consequences of bilingualism ultimately may really depend on which bilinguals, the interactional context of language use, and whether we measure brain or behavior. And some failures to replicate may fail to take these factors into account. So how can we begin to develop a causal account? I'm going to explore tonight 2 coordinated hypotheses, and I say coordinated because they're not mutually exclusive. two hypotheses about the source of these effects in bilingualism. The first hypothesis is what I've called native or dominant language regulation. What we've come to see is that language learners and skilled bilinguals acquire the ability to regulate the use of their native or second language. You might stop and say, wait a second, if you're learning the second language, everyone who's taken a second language class knows you need to learn the grammar, you need to learn the phonology, you need to acquire the vocabulary. And so it seems very odd to be focusing on the native language. And what we're going to argue is that dramatic changes occur to the native language that we think cognitively may be involved in regulating the native language to enable particularly adult learners to acquire the second language proficiently. The second hypothesis, which was stated by David Green and Jubin Abotalevi in 2013 initially and in a number of subsequent papers, argues that the use of two languages makes differential demands on cognitive resources as a function of the context of language use. So it depends on, bilinguals use language in many, many different ways, and until we're able to identify exactly the way bilinguals are using languages in particular contexts, we won't completely understand why some bilinguals may differ from other bilinguals. And so we need to ask how interactional context might shape language use. So time out for 1 second, just to say who is bilingual. And I'm going to take, which I think I'm speaking to the choir here, I'm going to take a cognitive psychologist view on this, which is that we're going to embrace the variation of language experience and consider many people to be bilingual. You're not only bilingual by virtue of being born into a family where there were two languages spoken and having spoken two languages or heard two languages your entire life. Bilinguals can be people who acquire the two languages early, they can be people who acquire the two languages late, and they can be people who are in the process of acquiring a second language. And so we're going to be quite liberal in our operationalizing bilingualism quite broadly, and of course be very careful in each study in how we talk about who the people really are. So let's consider hypothesis 1. The first hypothesis is that the native or dominant language is regulated. And the observation here, and I will admit that this metaphor is one that I think I'm responsible for, which may be a good or bad thing, is that the bilingual is a mental juggler. That what we see in the research, and this is actually one of the few things that's not controversial, there are now hundreds of studies that show that both languages are active even when bilinguals are asked to use one language alone. And so even if you speak a language other than English, you may not be aware consciously of that other language while I'm speaking English with you, but the evidence shows that there is pervasive activity of the other language regardless of your intention. This is an example of a Dutch speaker naming what is maybe the most common object in the Netherlands. Netherlands is, right, it's sort of like an Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds, but with bicycles. And bicycles are everywhere. And what we see is that even if you're a highly proficient Dutch speaker and you're deciding, should I call that bike or should I call it fiets, that you're making a decision about which language you need to speak. So you're juggling the presence of the two languages. We see evidence for parallel activation of the two languages in planning speech, in reading, and in listening to spoken language. Many past studies have documented these effects. It's interesting that they're documented not only for learners, where if you're a learner, you might think, oh, I'm a native English speaker in a classroom learning another language and I can't turn off my English. Well, these effects occur even for highly proficient bilinguals. They occur even for individuals who are proficient and who speak two languages that are quite distinct from one another, like Chinese and English, or American Sign Language and English. And they also occur not just for words, for the lexicon, but they occur for the phonology and for the grammar. And so what we're going to do is we're going to show that these interactions between, this juggling between the two languages, not only goes from the first language, that might be the stronger language, to the weaker language. But in fact, we're going to turn the tables and say this is going to go from the second language to the first language. So when do these effects come online? And the joke I make about this study is that when you study another language and you take a class, you would never think to go to the instructor and say, do you have an informed consent that I can fill out to say that my mind is going to be changed by taking this class? And we don't go to the IRB and say we need to have informed consent for classes. We just take it because we're eager to gain new knowledge. This is an example of a study that shows that the second language comes to influence your native language almost immediately. And so what we did is something very simple. We did lexical decision, where we see a string of letters and you simply decide in English, which was the native language of these learners. They were native English speakers in central Pennsylvania learning Spanish. And we simply asked them, is it a real word or not? And some of the words are cognates with Spanish, like tomato and tomate, or non-cognates, so they were different. The translations were different structurally, like book and libro. The question was, could we show that the Spanish starts to influence the English? And we did that by looking at their behavior, their button presses, and we also did EEG. We looked at what happened to their brain activity as they were doing this lexical decision task. And what we found, nothing in behavior. We found nothing in behavior. They look like monolingual speakers. But when we look at their brains, what we see is we had monolinguals. We had beginning learners in the very first semester of learning Spanish. And then I have to say, intermediate learners who are in the second semester of learning Spanish in central Pennsylvania are not proficient bilinguals. Be very clear about that. But what we see is we see an effect of cognate status begin to come online. So the Spanish is beginning to influence the English, even when they are quite non-proficient, when they're quite non-fluent in Spanish. And this is their native language, English. And so the native language is affected by the second language. Well, that's all well and good. That doesn't show that there's regulation. All it shows is that there's sensitivity that's beginning to develop, that the brains of these learners are beginning to take in and incorporate the second language, and it's beginning to affect the native language. But it's not that they're actually doing anything actively. That's really very different. And so we want to then look at some context where we think that there may actually be what we're calling regulation, that learners are doing something, and bilinguals are doing something that changes the native language. And I'm going to look at this in two different contexts. One is where learners are immersed. Many of you have had the experience of being immersed in another country, in another context where another language is spoken, and suddenly you may feel that your native language is not quite as available to you as it was. And we're also going to look at a case where we ask proficient bilinguals to speak their native language after they've spoken their second language for a while. And the argument that we're going to make in the studies I'm going to report are that the native language takes a hit. And a hit sounds like a terrible thing. But I'm going to argue that the hit may actually be a desirable difficulty. That being able to learn to regulate your native language may be a critical stage of becoming more proficient in a second language and incorporating the second language into the language system. So the first study is an immersion study. This is a study that first author was Jared Link, who was then a graduate student at Penn State and desperately wanted to go to Salamanca, where he had studied abroad as a student. And I said, oh, I'm sure we could come up with a study for you to go to Salamanca. And what he did is he did a series of battery of tasks in Salamanca, and he compared two different groups. One group were these immersed intermediate learners of Spanish. And I want to say again, these are native English speakers learning Spanish. They're not so proficient. They're just intermediate students who want to go abroad for one reason or the other to study Spanish. The other group are a group who are in Pennsylvania, very monolingual context, and they're also learning Spanish, but just in the classroom. And the result that I'm going to show you is going to show that the native language is suppressed when they are studying abroad. And what he did was to use a verbal fluency task, a semantic verbal fluency task. So I say fruits, and in 30 seconds you have to reel off as many fruits as you can think of, or vegetables, or animals, or whatever. And we do it in each language. We do it in English, their native language. We do it in Spanish, their language that they're learning. Which should they produce more in? These are intermediate learners who don't know that much Spanish. They should produce more English, and they do. You see the bars on the left show that they produce more exemplars in English than they do in Spanish. And if you look at the bars on the right, you see in L2 in Spanish, you see how the black bar is greater than the empty bar? Well, the point is that the students who are studying abroad are learning something. They are learning more Spanish. They're able to produce more Spanish. So that's money well spent on study abroad. Okay, the critical result in the study is on the left. And what you see on the left is you see that the students who are immersed in Salamanca produce less English. And initially we thought, well, maybe when you're abroad, you just don't speak English as much, so it just takes you longer time to get started. And so we look at this over the whole course of the experiment, and that's not what happens. What happens is the entire time they're immersed, in the entire experiment, we see that there's a suppression of their ability to speak English in this context. And so we were curious whether, and by the way, they do recover, so you don't have to write to the IRB about this. They recover when they come back. They maintain the benefit they get to Spanish, but they recover their ability to speak English. So we see more evidence of a hit for the L2 on the L1 in more proficient speakers who are required to switch between the two languages or mix the two languages. And many of you have seen the data that are on these slides. The data on the left are a switching study from a language switching study from Moiter and Allport. The results are very similar to the task switching literature. What you see is that there's a bigger hit to the easier task or the more dominant task. And so the L1 takes a hit when you have to switch on cue. Likewise, in the language mixing data shown on the right, you see that it's the native language that takes a hit. This happened to be a study with Dutch English bilinguals. When language is mixed and you don't know which language you're going to name from trial to trial, what you see is that the native language, the L1, is inhibited. And in fact, it's inhibited so much in these studies that these people are slower. These are proficient Dutch English bilinguals on the right. They're slower to speak Dutch than English. So we can temporarily reverse their language dominance in this context. So what we did in this study is we wanted to examine this regulation or inhibition of the L1 after speaking L2. It's a very simple study where we had people name pictures aloud. And so you see on the bottom, you see you have a set of pictures in English with their English names, a set of pictures with Chinese names. These are L1 Chinese speakers. And all we did in the study was we manipulated whether they first spoke Chinese and then spoke English or the reverse. And in this study, we measured behavior, but critically we measured EEG. And what we found was that when we repeated the same picture twice, if you look at the data on the right, these are ERP data, and it's right for CZ, right in the middle of your head, where what we see is repetition of pictures helps if you're speaking the second language. So if you first name the picture in your native language and then you had to switch to your second language, it helps to repeat the same object. Very common kind of repetition priming phenomenon. The critical result is on the left. What we see on the left is that repetition hurts for the native language. What we see is that if you name pictures in your second language and you name for a while, and then we switch you to name in your native language, we see inhibition in the native language. We see a pattern in the ERP data that's more negative. We see increased negativity that's associated with inhibitory processing. And so what we see is that there is a pattern in simple picture naming that suggests that even in the laboratory, in a very short period of time, we can induce this kind of a broad effect, this kind of immersion effect, just by speaking the second language. And again, don't want to raise the IRB too many times, but you might think we're supposed to leave participants in the same shape as they came into the study. In this study, this inhibition effect never went away. It does eventually go away, but it didn't go away in the hour in which they were in the laboratory. It's a very persistent effect. And we've now done these studies using fMRI. I'm not going to go into detail, but the main thing to point out is that you see much more activation of the L1 in these studies where you see the differential order than in the L2. It's L1 that's taking the hit and where you're seeing greater brain activity when you have to speak the L1 after speaking the L2. And in this second study that Eleonora Rossi is first author on, you see that brain activation is greater even if you don't speak L2. So what we find is that bilinguals at the beginning of a study, if we just have them name pictures in L1, already show greater brain activation, suggesting that their brains have changed as a function of being bilingual. So where else do we see this inhibition of the L1? In a number of recent studies, there has been a report that these bilingual Alzheimer's patients who report with symptoms 4 to 5 years later than monolinguals are no longer able to speak their L2. They're no longer able to speak their L2. Why? Well, there are a number of alternative explanations, but the idea is that at the point where they have run out of cognitive or neural reserve, they may be unable to inhibit their L1. So they may have lost the ability with their dementia to inhibit their L1. And this is a hypothesis that hasn't been tested rigorously yet, but it's very tempting to think that it is in fact a very similar mechanism to the mechanism we see in the laboratory. So the native language is not the Rock of Gibraltar. The L2 has persistent effects on the L1. And for learners and also for proficient bilinguals, these interactions we think come to change the native language. For proficient bilinguals, they come to converge. So we see changes in both languages, and they come to sit in fundamentally the same place in the brain. It's the same neural tissue that's supporting both languages. And one interesting implication is that it suggests that a monolingual native speaker model for learning a second language may not be the right model, that we may want a bilingual native speaker model or proficient model, because bilinguals do not look like monolinguals in either of their two languages. And I just want to mention one other study that Roxana Botezatu has done that I think is very exciting. This is research that shows also that the native language is not the Rock of Gibraltar. So we have phenomena in psycholinguistics that we believe in, that we think have been replicated 1,000 times, and we think are really fundamental facts about how language works. One of them has to do with the effect of regularity and consistency in naming words. So in English, we have these horrible exception words, and we know from Seidenberg and McClelland and going way back that there are very reliable effects. It takes you longer to name words that are not regular. Well, what this study shows is that there is a temporary period of time in second language learning where that phenomenon is shaken up, and where it goes away in the native language. It comes back. It comes back. So these learners recover. But very briefly during second language learning, there's a moment where the native language, this principle that's so fundamental in the native language, seems to disappear briefly, to go underground while this process of second language learning is occurring. So we can ask the question, is this just about words? Everything I've spoken about so far has been lexical. It's been about words. And I don't have the time tonight, given the scope of the talk, to go into gory detail, but I'm going to mention just one study that shows that, in fact, it's also about the grammar. This is a study that was done by my colleague Julie Ducius at Penn State, looking at relative clause attachment, which is a phenomenon that's been looked at a lot in the psycholinguistic literature. So you have sentences that are a mouthful, like Peter fell in love with the daughter of the psychologist who studied in California. And then you say, who studied in California? And it turns out that if you're a native English speaker, you would prefer to attach low. You'll say, it was the psychologist who studied in California. Whereas if you're a native Spanish speaker, you tend to prefer to attach high. You'll say, it's the daughter. Now, what they found in this study, and I haven't shown the data here because I just don't have time to include all the details, but what they found in the study is really quite amazing. What they found is that native Spanish speakers who are highly proficient in English and who are living in an English environment, but who have not attrited in Spanish, they're actively using Spanish. They begin to parse Spanish like English. They begin to parse their L1 like the L2. And so we see across the board that there are these effects of the second language on the first language. Now, how can we coordinate that, what I'm calling a regulation of the native language, with this adaptive control idea? How do these phenomena change in different contexts as a function of the demands that are placed on bilingual speakers? And the notion here is that immersion in the L2 may be one context. And when you're immersed, you have very different set. You can't speak English with everyone. You may not be able to speak English with everyone. You may have to think very carefully about with whom you speak which languages. And so how can we characterize the linguistic, social, and cultural context of language use that may differentially engage cognitive resources and ultimately shape these consequences of bilingualism? So we know that there's a lot of variation in how bilinguals use language, that some bilinguals code switch. So in the middle of discourse, they will switch from one language to the other. Code switching for many years was misunderstood. In fact, probably the greatest mythology about bilingualism is about code switching, as if it were pathological. Code switching is a very common feature for many bilingual groups. And if you listen or eavesdrop to code switch conversations, you'll hear that it's very fluent. It's very seamless going from one language to the other. Okay, at the same time, bilinguals differ in terms of whether they're dominant in their native language or their second language. If you've lived a long time in a context that doesn't support your native language, you may become more proficient, more dominant in the language of the environment. And so you may switch language dominance. Some bilinguals live in a context where others are similarly bilingual. But others live in a context where only few are bilingual or only few speak the languages that they speak. So the way resources are going to be recruited are going to vary as a function of these demands on the speaker. And Gigi Luck and Ellen Bialystok have made the point that bilingualism is not a categorical variable. We need to see it as a continuum and to understand the full complexity of it. So the question I want to ask then is what language processes might affect regulation and coordination of cognitive resources? So code switching is one possibility. Social networks and language decision-making, who you're speaking with in what context. Being immersed in the L2, we have this picture of Salamanca again. Or linguistic diversity in the environment. Some people, having lived in central Pennsylvania for a long time, in some of those blue places on the map, are not particularly diverse. Whereas other contexts, Southern California, where I now live, is extremely diverse. How does that matter? So, what is the consequence of being a habitual code switcher? This is a study by Annie Beatty Martinez, who's here somewhere, and Julie Ducius, that asked the question of how code switching might actually affect sentence processing. And what they did is to present speakers, bilingual speakers who were Spanish-English bilinguals, but some of whom code switched a lot and others did not. And the ones who did not lived in Granada, Spain, where everybody's proficient, and university students are proficient in Spanish and English, but they use the two languages in different contexts. And what they showed, this is an EEG study, what they showed is that non-code switchers, if they read a sentence that was code switched from between English and Spanish, non-code switchers show a processing cost when you introduce a switch. Habitual code switchers only show a processing cost when there's a rare code switch. And so when you identify code switches that are attested in corpora as being quite common based upon the way languages are used, the habitual code switchers, in fact, process those as if they were in the same language. So it's very dramatic. It shows that the processing costs depend not only on whether there's a code switch in the sentence, but on the nature of the bilingual. Another example, a very lovely example in a paper that just appeared in JEP, this is a paradigm that Jared Novick's lab has used quite a lot. This is the University of Maryland, where what they do is to take an executive function task, in this case they took the flanker task, and they interleave it with a language processing task. And in this case, it's a language processing task where bilinguals are processing sentences that are code switched or not. And what they show is that integrating a code switch during online comprehension engages domain general cognitive control. And what you see in this graph are the mean reaction times to perform the flanker task and what you see is you see a particular change when incongruent flanker trials follow code switch sentences. And so it shows that these language processes are in fact engaging domain general cognitive resources. So how does code switching affect coordination between bilinguals? A very important line of research in psycholinguistics considers how speakers and listeners align with one another. And a lot of that research looks at alignment within language, just within speaking to one another, and understanding and discourse how that occurs. For code switching, we can ask the question, do bilinguals, when they code switch with one another, learn to align, so they learn to be able to predict that a code switch is coming up? And I'm not showing all the details of the study because there are many and they're complex, but this is a combination study that did a corpus analysis and then did a visual world eye tracking study. And what it shows is that for Spanish-English bilinguals, speech rate slows down before a code switch. And English becomes more Spanish-like. What it does is it interjects a very subtle phonetic cue into the speech stream. And so the question then was, could bilinguals in an online sentence processing task actually pick up that phonetic cue and anticipate that a code switch is coming up? And the answer in this study is that they do. So bilinguals seem to learn to predict whether a code switch is going to occur. And the metaphor that I've used for this is that bilinguals may be learning to do the tango with one another. They may be learning to dance. This is a linguistic dance. This alignment may be an index of bilingual language regulation, and that we don't know very much about really how this works in different contexts that are linguistically or culturally diverse, but that this tuning may be a very, very important part of identifying the causal mechanism in language that may be producing cognitive changes. And we have done some research, this is work by Megan Zernstein and colleagues, showing that prediction itself may engage L1 regulation and control. This was a study, an EEG study, that just looked at very sort of seemingly simple, read a sentence that has a completion that's either predictable or not, and you can look at what happens if you make the wrong prediction and have to correct an error that you make. And it turns out people have asked the question, can bilinguals reading in their second language be sensitive to these kinds of prediction phenomena? And what this study showed, and again, it's complex and I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but what the study showed is we needed to know what their cognitive control ability was, as well as their ability to regulate the native language, to be able to identify a pattern of prediction in online sentence comprehension that looked like they were able to do the prediction task. This is okay. So, not all bilingual experience produces the same consequences. Some bilinguals code switch, some don't. We can ask the question, is code switching the critical experience? Is that what's critical about being bilingual? This is a study that was recently published by Ana Binu Martinez as the first author. Recently, it's in press, it's online at JEP. And what we did in the study is to go to 3 different places, and that wonderful international network that I showed at the beginning has really provided fantastic support for being able to do studies that are comparative studies of language use, where we can go to different places in the world and ask, how is language being used in these different places, even if speakers speak the very same languages? So we went to Granada, Spain, where Teresa Baja's lab is a very important source of collaboration. And in Granada, Spain, you have the university students are proficient Spanish, English bilinguals, but they use Spanish as their home language, their community language, and English as the work or school language. And so they use the languages separately. They don't code switch very much. We then went to San Juan, Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, people are proficient Spanish, English bilinguals, but they use the 2 languages in virtually all contexts. And so this is what we called an integrated context. The 2 languages are used all the time. They code switch a lot. They don't have to stop to think, who am I speaking with and what are we talking about? They can just use either language. The languages are cooperative, opportunistically. And then we come back to our favorite place in the world, State College, Pennsylvania. And in State College, Pennsylvania, you have native Spanish speakers who are studying at Penn State who are proficient in English. They're living in an English-dominant environment. They're highly proficient in both languages. And they tend to code switch with one another. But we call this the varied context, because if you're a Spanish-English bilingual in State College, not everybody in State College speaks Spanish. In fact, not many in State College speak Spanish. So you have to be monitoring your environment to consider with whom can I speak? With whom can I code switch? And so the question here was, how would these groups differ? We performed a variety of lexical production tasks. The critical data I'm going to show you are from picture naming. What we did is we used the AXCPT, which is a executive function task that has been thought to enable separation of proactive and reactive inhibitory control. This is where you see a sequence, and in most sequences, the AQ ends after a set of distractors by the X probe, but in some sequences, you end with the Y. The task is set up so 70% of the time it ends in X. You're led to predict, you're led to expect that X is going to occur. And so what's very difficult is when the Y occurs and you're tripped, okay? So you see a high error rate in this task. The question was, do bilinguals engage these proactive and reactive control processes differently to perform language tasks? And what we found is that the critical data in this study are for the Spanish-English bilinguals in State College, Pennsylvania. It turns out that only they have greater reliance on proactive control processes. They have greater reliance on context. What does it mean? It means that if you are in this immersed environment, and you need to hold on to your Spanish, but not many people speak Spanish, you are monitoring the environment, you are monitoring the situation, so that if you have high proactive control, you're able to keep the Spanish alive. If you have low proactive control, you succumb. you become a dominant English speaker. What do we see in Puerto Rico? Not much that we can identify this way. There's sort of a mixture of effects. What do we see in Granada, Spain? In Granada, Spain, they rely more on reactive control. So when you have the languages separately, you see reactive control. When you have the languages in this context where you're making very active decision making about with whom can I speak which language, you're very actively using proactive processes. And so these are three groups of Spanish English speakers. They're all highly proficient. In the previous literature on bilingualism, we would have aggregated these data. We would have said we have 90 Spanish English bilinguals. They're all the same. They are not all the same. They're different by virtue of where they live and the demands that are placed on them to use each language. A similar effort and a similar story has developed here in Montreal from Jason Gullifer and Deborah Titone's work using a measure they call language entropy. It's a measure to begin to identify who people are speaking with, how many different speakers, and they show that in fact using structural imaging you can show that you get differential impacts of these social networks that are identified on language control. There is also an effort, a neuroscience effort in Reading, England, by Christos Pleistokos, looking at a model, trying to model these structural plasticity changes that occur as individuals move from being less skilled to being more skilled, and making the argument that the changes that occur for language are actually quite similar to many of the changes that occur in other domains of skill learning. So I want to end with a study that was completely serendipitous. And as I've already said, I moved from Pennsylvania to California. And when I made that move, I knew that the bilinguals would be different because what we have, remember that blue map with the red on the edges? Well, the bilinguals in Southern California are for the most part heritage speakers of a home language. They're individuals who learned their language other than English at home, and they're individuals who are typically early bilinguals, whereas many of the bilinguals in Pennsylvania are late bilinguals. So a former student who's now a postdoc, Kenzie Bice, did a dissertation where she started the dissertation in State College. And then I came into the lab one day and I said, we're moving. And you can, as a graduate student, you can decide whether that's a good or bad thing, but she was very upbeat and she said, I'm packing my swimming suit and going with you. And we moved to California. But here's the part of it that we didn't anticipate. In her study, she was teaching people novel language information that they hadn't learned, and she was interested in whether bilinguals are better language learners. You might think bilinguals would be better language learners than monolinguals. They know a lot more about language. And she had monolingual controls. And so we had a bunch of bilinguals, monolinguals in State College, Pennsylvania, and a group of monolinguals in Riverside, California. And it wasn't the main focus of the study at all. And what she did is she taught them Finnish vowel harmony. How many people here, I can't, the glare of the light makes it hard to see. Anybody here speak Finnish? Good, not many, okay. And Finnish has a rule, a vowel harmony rule. And the reason we taught people Finnish vowel harmony is that it's not known to most English speakers. And certainly it wasn't known to our students at Penn State, and it wasn't known to our students at UC Riverside. And so what happened is they learned this Finnish vowel harmony. They used this as a way we used it as a way to teach words in Finnish. And we had these two groups of monolinguals. The group in Riverside they're monolingual. They only speak English, but they're living in a very diverse environment. The monolinguals in State College, as you already know from my description, are living in a very English-dominant environment. And what happened in the study is that both groups learned. This is an EEG study. Both groups, the graph on the top shows the EEG data and then the behavioral data next to it. And you can see that both groups learned. If anything, the group in Pennsylvania did a little bit better, but not significantly better. Both groups learned the rule. They learned the Finnish vowel harmony rule. Here's the critical serendipitous result. We bring them back into the lab to do a test of generalization. We present exemplars of this Finnish vowel harmony rule that they haven't seen before. And nobody can do it behaviorally. You can see the behavioral data is not, it's almost not visible to you. What happens in their brains? Well, the people in Pennsylvania look like a ER movie where everybody's died. Their signal is just, okay. What happens in California? In California, what we see is that the monolingual brains look like bilingual brains. They're able to generalize. Their brains are generalizing this rule that they learned in the learning task. Now, if anything, we didn't design the study for this purpose. We have to be very cautious about interpreting it. But we think it might suggest that living in a linguistically diverse environment may, in fact, enhance new language learning. If anything, the California monolinguals are much lower SES than the Pennsylvania monolinguals, making it a result that might be opposite to what you would have predicted under other circumstances. We clearly need to follow this up, but it suggests that linguistic diversity may in fact be a benefit and not a cost. Okay, how can I bring this together? So I want to argue that we need to capture the social and linguistic diversity of language use to develop models that account for these dynamic changes that occur across interactional contexts and across the lifespan. I've only presented a snippet of the data tonight, but there are many, many other studies that are consistent with the points that I'm making. The findings that I've reported, I believe, point to a possible set of causal mechanisms for beginning to understand why there might be consequences of bilingualism and why those consequences may be different in different contexts. And it's not only that there are different types of bilinguals and monolinguals, but that those differences have implications for how linguistic and cognitive processes are engaged. And we've written a number of papers about variation in bilingual language use, and what we've shown here is that you have a very dynamic system. The native language is affected by the second language. We see these changes across bilinguals, and we see the changes within individuals. Those individual Spanish-English speakers I showed you a moment ago who were in State College, Pennsylvania, weren't born in State College, Pennsylvania. They were Spanish-English bilinguals of another variety when they came to State College. They changed as adults. And so what we see is these changes occur within people's lives as they move from one environment to the other. In past research in both linguistics and psycholinguistics, many of these phenomena were previously identified as attrition, saying this is language loss. And what we see now is this is just the ordinary dynamic of being bilingual and being in different contexts. And we think that this individual variation reveals the nature of these dynamics. So to return to the dual, is there a bilingual advantage? Well, I think there may be many advantages beyond the ability to speak more than one language. We think there may be a few costs, but we think that those costs reflect the ordinary dynamics of language use and language learning that may in fact enable new language learning. We think there may be instances in which there are no effects at all. And so bilingualism itself is a complex life experience. Bilingualism is much more common than most people realize. More people in the world are bilingual or multilingual. That blue US map makes it very deceptive if you're coming from the US. So bilingualism is actually quite common, but it's also, as I've tried to argue, more complex. And we need to embrace the variation. We need not only to exercise, but we need to embrace the variation and that complexity using methods that are rigorous and that exploit a range of different interactional contexts. And we think that only then will we begin to understand the consequences of learning and speaking two languages. And I invite you to visit us in our new laboratory at UC Irvine. We have a new language science PhD program, I think the first in the country, that will begin fall 2020. And I will just say that there's no snow there. So it's a lot warmer. Thank you.
What a great start to our conference. Programmatic, interesting, groundbreaking. Please find Judy later throughout the conference. She's happy to chat with you. Opening reception on the other side of that wall. Have a great Psychonomics.